Hi, Gary Stearman. Time for another update from Prophecy Watchers. In studio with us today is Ken Johnson. And Ken, good to have you here.
Good to be back.
Ken's brought another new book. And, this one, Ken, I think it's a little controversial. We'll talk about some of the controversy, but it's really interesting because it provides yet another window on Bible prophecy. It's called The Ancient Apocalypse of Ezra. And of course, everybody's heard of Ezra, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ezra and Nehemiah, they came back after the Babylonian captivity, were involved in rebuilding the temple and so forth. And Ezra is considered a valid biblical prophet. But the ancient apocalypse of Ezra is called Second Esdras in the King James Version of 1611, which I have right here. It's the Apocrypha, that little collection of books right in the middle of the Bible that the King James Version had in it. And Ezra is really, he opens that segment, First and Second Esdras, as it's called. And what did you find there of great interest?
Well, it's interesting. I studied that in seminary, but it gives a prophecy about how the Roman Empire falls and connects it with Daniel's fourth beast. And it gives a detailed analysis of how many Caesars there are and when they are and their relation to each other in years between the fall of the split of the kingdom in 395 rather, and the fall of the kingdom in 476. And it's exactly perfect. The oldest script of that we have dates from about AD 200. And so to have an actual prophecy a few hundred years at least, if not further back, before the events happen is pretty amazing. But it goes on to talk about the Roman Empire fragmenting into three large empires, which we know from history to be Rome that fell in 476, the Byzantine Empire that fell in 1453, and the Holy Roman Empire that fell in the 1800s. So it's an amazing prophecy like that. What we didn't know until recently is it actually contains a prophecy of this current Syrian war.
Yeah, and now that is what I found most interesting. Well, there are a lot of things that I found interesting, but the Syrian war is kind of unique. If you stop and think about it, the geographical layout of the battlefield in the Middle East right now, you have Israel, Syria to the north, all the contenders gathered around Syria with Russia to the north. Very specific. And you find that configuration actually in the book of the Apocalypse of Ezra.
Yes, and it actually was quoted by a couple of early church fathers too. So it was well known back in the 2nd century.
So anything we can do to, I think, enhance the view that we have now is a good thing, particularly if you find something that is listed as apocryphal, which means that we do not consider it to be part of the canon of Scripture, but on the other hand, it augments what we find in Scripture.
Yeah, like Josephus.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating to me that, for example, in the Apocrypha, and once again, I'm holding a 1611 King James Bible here, and there is a declaration from the king right at the front of this book that says it must be printed to include the Apocrypha under penalty as given by the king. So in other words, there was a sharp penalty for excluding the Apocrypha.
Right.
And I find that fascinating as a historical event. It's also fascinating that particularly those who look at the King James as rock solid often sort of eliminate from their thinking the fact that, well, the original King James had the Apocrypha in it.
Right. We normally think of the Apocrypha as Roman Catholic and dubious in that sense, but the Anglican fathers that put together, the scholars that put together the King James, included the Apocalypse of Ezra, which is an old scroll, but it's not part of the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. So there is a difference.
So this is fascinating, and talk for a minute about what Ezra says that really throws light on the current Middle East situation.
Oh, well, it talks about a time when the dragon nations of Arabia, as they're called, form an alliance. They're a group of somewhat end times people that have an ideology or a religion that's anti-Semitic. We know that to be Islam. And there's other prophecies amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Church Fathers. Hippolytus mentions them as the senseless desert nations. But this group of Muslim nations, called the Dragon Nations of Arabia, decide for whatever reason that Syria needs to be destroyed. So they create this army to do so and place it in a no man's zone where a war had already kind of cleared everything out, east of Syria, and they attack from the east and almost destroy Syria until a large group, a cloud of nations basically, or a cloud of armies come in from the far north, which assumably would be Russia. But it talks about this task force all of a sudden coming to their senses, knowing who they really are, and turning on their masters. So this task force attacking Syria, we might call it ISIS, ends up destroying or trying to threaten to destroy everybody and anybody, which is exactly what we're seeing now. And we see the outcome of the war. And Russia enters the war, begins to take the situation.
Yeah.
It goes on and describes how the war ends, what the ramifications are of it, and what happens later on.
And you don't think that you're adding anything to the text. You're using your own imagination to enhance these things. You find it there in black and white.
Yes.
And what it does is give us a broader picture or some confirmation of the things that we already see in the canon of Scripture.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. We don't want to add it to the canon of Scripture.
Right.
But when somebody says, here's a prophecy of something, you look at it, it either fits or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you set it away. It could be accurate, it could be mistranslated, it could be fake, but those are all things that we want to look at.
Right.
The number one thing you want to look at is, does it agree with Scripture? Does it disagree with Scripture? How old is the oldest manuscript? Is there any kind of a probability? Because they do the same thing with the book of Daniel. Daniel is so prophetically significant, there's no way he could have known in advance, so
Right.
it must have been written during the 1st century. Well, unless there's prophecy. You get people that don't believe in prophecy, but it's pretty specific.
And here's the interesting thing. The Apocrypha includes, for example, the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which talk about the Maccabean Wars, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the profaning of the temple, and all of those things that we really wouldn't know about historically if we didn't have that Apocrypha.
Right.
So it does validate itself historically. And if someone like Ezra, who's already accepted as a prophet of God in the canon of Scripture, if he makes statements that are recorded elsewhere, though we don't regard it as Scripture, it certainly adds to our comprehension in other ways. And once again, digging deeper than a lot of other people do, and I think that's just amazing. In fact, probably most people wouldn't have the patience to dig into some of these dark corners the way you do.
It's just fascinating to me. I mean, for instance, the legend of Ezra writing the Targums is mentioned specifically in this book, and it's quoted by the Talmud, by the early church fathers, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the whole thing. So anybody who is anybody in the ancient times is familiar with this and treating it like it's at least accurate history. And so it's just something that we need to look at.
It's accurate history, but it's also kind of taking a view of the future.
Yes.
Here's what Ezra saw when he looked into the future. Having completed this, and by the way, the book's called The Ancient Apocalypse of Ezra. Having completed this, kind of looking back at it, what does this really do for you? This whole study do for your thinking?
Well, it lets me know that I think we're getting closer to the end times. I don't think the rapture is necessarily going to be this month or anything like that, but I can't see it being too far off. And the Apocalypse of Ezra actually talks about a group of people that come back or come with the Messiah when he sets up his kingdom. It's a group of people that have never tasted death. So that gets us to the possibility of a pre-trib rapture. These people are called the bride. These people are gone for a 7-day silence, which is some sort of a persecution or a time of Jacob's trouble. So the language is different, but again, you see the same symbolism over and over.
And it supports dispensationalism as we commonly believe it.
Yeah, it's so amazing how many old scrolls do. The same story keeps coming up over and over and over.
I like these people that have never tasted death, and they are with Messiah at his coming.
Yeah, I want to be one of those too.
I would want to be one of those. And I agree with you. We're living in that general time. We don't set dates. We attempt to unravel the times and the seasons. We attempt to theorize. For example, how long between the rapture and the beginning of the 7-year tribulation is a currently discussed question. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and we all want to know, is there something that could give us a hint that the rapture is even closer? Well, I don't know. I'm certainly not setting a date, but my faith is driven by curiosity, among other things. I think God put that in my heart, my mind.
Yeah. Well, we're told to study prophecy, and we're blessed if we do, and we don't want to have a fear of accidentally maybe setting a date. Therefore, we just won't study prophecy at all. We're supposed to study.
The author is Ken Johnson. His latest book, The Ancient Apocalypse of Ezra. And of course, we're going to be offering that and many, many other works of Ken's here at Prophecy Watchers. Ken, thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to be talking to Ken more in the near future, so you keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter, or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.